Small and medium-sized enterprises are the economic engines of emerging markets like Northern Thailand, but they operate under a distinct disadvantage: severe limitations in capital, advanced infrastructure, and technical training. Look at the factory floor. Workers often rely on older, heavy industrial machinery rather than state-of-the-art automation. In classical strategic management, this is a fatal flaw. The resource-based view dictates that to achieve a sustained competitive advantage, a firm needs tangible assets that are valuable, rare, and difficult for competitors to copy. If an SME lacks deep financial reserves, cutting-edge technology, and economies of scale, how can it possibly survive against larger, better-funded competitors? A 2026 empirical study out of Northern College provides the answer. In resource-constrained environments, a firm's survival relies almost entirely on its intangible architecture. This conceptual model maps the pathways from specific behaviors to tangible business results. We start at the top with entrepreneurial leadership, and the ultimate goal down here is organizational performance. But the specific gears connecting top to bottom remain invisible. This study demonstrates that leadership is not an ethereal soft skill. It is a precise engineering process that builds a firm's intangible balance sheet. We can map these internal gears by looking at the study's final structural equation model. The model begins with entrepreneurial leadership. In this context, that means a manager's ability to recognize market opportunities, act proactively, and orient the firm toward innovation. There is a direct path connecting this behavior to organizational performance, with a beta coefficient of 0.32. While a beta of 0.32 is statistically significant, it leaves much of the firm's performance unexplained. To find the missing variables, we have to examine the mediators. This brings us to the knowledge-based view of the firm. This theory argues that knowledge itself is the ultimate strategic resource, collectively known as intellectual capital. The first pillar is human capital. This represents the actual competencies, skills, and learning capacity of the employees. The second pillar is structural capital. These are the codified routines, data systems, and institutionalized processes that keep the business running even if key employees leave. The third pillar is relational capital, which measures stakeholder trust and the firm's embeddedness in external networks, like supplier relationships and customer loyalty. When we look at the coefficients between entrepreneurial leadership and these three assets, we see massive numbers: 0.61, 0.55, and 0.58. In practice, this means these leaders prioritize the creation of internal systems and external networks over simple daily oversight. Intellectual capital does not emerge organically as a firm ages. It requires deliberate cultivation by leadership to take root. Once these intellectual assets are built, they flow outward to generate actual organizational performance. Among the three pillars, relational capital is the strongest individual predictor of success, posting a beta coefficient of 0.33. But the most important metric is the R-squared value for organizational performance, which sits at 0.61. In the social sciences, an R-squared of 0.61 is exceptionally high. It means this single architectural framework explains 61% of the total variance in whether one of these SMEs succeeds or fails. A skeptic might point to obvious economic advantages instead. Doesn't a business naturally perform better if it has more employees, or if it sells its products to lucrative overseas markets? The researchers tested those exact demographic variables in Table 5 to ensure the integrity of the model. First, they compared small enterprises to medium-sized ones. The resulting p-values were 0.432 and 0.222. Next, they checked export status, comparing firms that sell internationally against those that only sell domestically. Those p-values were 0.061 and 0.341. Because all of these p-values exceed 0.05, the data proves there is zero structural advantage to simply being a slightly larger firm or selling overseas. Exposing a firm with poor internal knowledge architecture to global markets does not increase its productivity. Internal capability and leadership architecture completely override macroeconomic exposure and demographics in determining organizational resilience. Stepping back from the raw data, this entire mechanism functions as a dynamic capability. It is the continuous ability to sense market opportunities and reconfigure resources to match them. This insight directly challenges the current macro policy landscape. In Northern Thailand, SMEs operate under top-down initiatives like the Thailand 4.0 agenda, which aims to drive innovation-based economic growth. The flaw in these initiatives is their target. State programs that focus on capital, technology, or export subsidies will fail if the firm lacks the leadership capability to absorb and organize those resources. Governments and institutions must pivot their strategy. Instead of relying on size-based financial subsidies, they need to focus on ecosystem-wide leadership capacity building. In practice, this means directing funding toward digital transformation grants, leadership academies, and structural frameworks that encourage knowledge sharing across regional supply chains. Building these internal systems directly aligns with modern environmental, social, and governance priorities. Strong human capital drives inclusive employment, while relational capital enforces transparent governance and stakeholder trust. Leadership is highly quantifiable. As that 61% variance proves, it is the firm's most critical asset. Capital and macro exposure are secondary to the internal architecture, built by leaders who actively orchestrate their intellectual capital.